cybersecurity, a lot of us think about attacks, blocking attacks, putting technical controls in place, things like how do we protect an environment from the endpoints, from, routing, from, combining firewalling and pushing data into security analytics tools, such, a security endpoint management or a security operating center that would have a SIM tool in there. The basics of cybersecurity, when we think about cybersecurity from a 101 perspective, is cybersecurity is about people, processes, and technology. Now, what we have seen when it comes to cybersecurity, we focus heavily on the technology aspect, and to a lesser extent on the people and the processes perspective. Now, the difference between, cybersecurity and GRC in a sense is traditionally, when we think about GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, we think about, internal audit. What kind of controls or what sort of testing is internal audit looking to get done, that in turn they can create their reporting, their gap analysis of deficiencies within an operating environment, and present that back to leadership teams. Now, in anticipation, I would say some of these internal IT audit prepare such exercises for the external auditor to come in and verify. Now, technologists, cybersecurity technologists, some of them tend to think of this as, an annoyance, simply because we can have a GRC, an internal audit team, come in and run through a bunch of testing. Okay, do you have a security policy? Yes, check. In your security policy, do you have access controls defined? Yes, check. Do you have an access control policy? Yes, check. Do you have passwords with complexity? Yes, check. Now, all of this is sort of done in a silo and separately from cybersecurity itself, in the sense that you have a checklist, a paper test, and that paper test comes up with an attestation that you are doing what you should be doing per a regulatory requirement. That regulatory requirement, if you are in healthcare in the US, it will be aligned to HIPAA, which has two policy requirements, or two rules, the HIPAA security rule and the HIPAA privacy rule requirements. And again, it's a vast checklist of, are you doing this? Should you have this particular control in place? Or you must have complexity, as I mentioned, with passwords. Now, with that said, all of this still has to be enforced by a technical control, which cyber teams put into place. The challenge we have between both of this is both operate sort of separate and siloed from each other. And I would say the gap we have is that our technologists don't clearly understand or don't clearly map to or buy into what the audit or what the governance and the regulatory teams are looking for. Now, the most important thing, from a business perspective, is the C in GRC, right? That compliance. Are we in compliant with what GDPR wants for data privacy? Are we opt-in? Are we opt-out? Well, typically, we have an opt-in by default outside the US, and in the US you have to check the opt-out. You are by default opted in, which quite a few of us think we should have the option to opt in rather than the option to opt out for certain privacy related data collection and so on. Now, where we are seeing a move or where we should drive a certain collaboration is the risk part. within GRC and cybersecurity. And why I say that, Atakan mentioned, for instance, the SolarWinds attack, for example. And when it came to that, what we saw was, certain updates that were made and certain updates that weren't made that drove the execution of that attack. So what we think is by combining aspects of GRC itself, by combining aspects of integrated risk management with practical cybersecurity controls, that is where we need to move forward. Simply because in the mind of an opponent is a sentient being, and what our opponents are looking for is not, hey, does Enterprise A meet ISO 27001? Do they have that certification? They don't care about all of that. What they care about is, does Enterprise A has an application with a vulnerability that I can find, and in that vulnerability, I can then drop a piece of malicious code, malware, a payload, and then with that payload, I can look for a way in. Typically, the way in would be, in addition to finding a vulnerability in an application, is elevating an identity privilege, and hence the development of MyVayda, powered by Big ML, of course. Attackers, when they find an identity upon which they can execute elevated privileges, when they execute what's called lateral attacks across systems, what happens is, they can expose IP, they can collect data, they can exfiltrate data, PII, IP, outside of an environment. And of course, as we all know, those of us in cybersecurity, they can change database fields, inputs, delete files, delete fields, and so on and so forth. All of that could occur within an enterprise that has an ISO 27001 certification, that has passed a security audit, that has had a pen test done. And, one of the clients that Jaymin and I have worked with, they had a pen test done, and they got, the results of the gap analysis, and they were working to remediate and so on. But unbeknownst to them, they were already under attack. And unknowns to them, the attackers had found what they needed. And, a couple of weeks after the pen test was completed, they were hit with a ransomware attack. And now that's where we hit the next level of cybersecurity and GRC, right? Because when we think about GRC, and we think about the governance aspect of that, one of the key things to governance is communication, and having the right communication plan that maps to incident response, that maps to the regulatory requirements and meets compliance mandates. And that communication from that governance perspective should map back to your cybersecurity perspective. Simply because if we're under attack, cybersecurity does not want to hear about, audits and so on. They're thinking block and tackle, respond, remediate, segment, and all hands on deck when it comes to figuring out an attack path and reducing that attack path, or stopping it, or shutting down a specific system, or even further, are certain systems that we know are highly critical, how segmented are they from that particular attack path? Where we think GRC should be made better, and it's not with using a metric stream tool or an Archer tool or looking at the repository of policies and so on, but where we think it should be made better is putting a third leg where we say cybersecurity, GRC, and underscoring all of that, risk management. And risk management should tie to the actual business operations itself. And why do I say that? When we think cybersecurity, again, we think endpoint detection and response. Um, we think volumetric analytics from a SOC. We think firewall rules and setting up firewall rule bases. And all of these things with machine learning, we can actually improve on how we tune, harness, and how we respond in a faster, precise, and more effective manner, reducing the volumetrics, reducing false positives, reducing rules and rule sets that are redundant, or rules and rule sets that are buried so deep within a system that an audit may miss it. So that's sort of really where I want to set the stage and speak about the whys for, or the pros and cons when it comes to cybersecurity, versus GRC. That silo that exists, we have to ensure that it's stopped. I talked about identity and so on, and looking at different environments and how it ties, into identity. Now, with cybersecurity, what we focus on is accessing, that data, and with modern environments, as we're seeing with moving to the cloud, IoT devices, mobile devices, and of course, other endpoint devices that cover your environment, we're seeing that cybersecurity protection that we had in traditional, where you walk into a building, that is gone. So what should we focus on when it comes to cybersecurity is more on the access. And this is where, when we talk about identity, from a cybersecurity perspective, identity has now become your new security parameter. Okay, so being the new security parameter, now we are seeing that function of identity has evolved. And identity typically would be, who has access to what, and what systems, and what privileges, and of course, what entitlements, meaning what they can or cannot do within an environment. We have seen the need to evolve that from that defensive and control to ensure that we drive more enablement across mobile, cloud, and social networks themselves. Simply because identity owners look at accessing investments, we're looking at moving from legacy or homegrown IAM systems to a standardized commercial model. And this is where, when we say we're moving from that homegrown IAM to a standardized commercial model, this is where the GRC aspects comes into play and can map better with cybersecurity, with IAM, in that we can create the right audit trails. We can use machine learning to simplify some of the learning, some of the analytics, and remove some of the manual interactions and make it more automated and simplified. And that drives more compliance, that drives better auditability and so on. And it also hones in on ensuring the effectiveness of controls and auditability within a next-gen IAM environment. So some of the things that we are using with our system, as we try to harness that IR portion I mentioned, or that risk management, portion I mentioned, tied into GRC and cybersecurity, is looking at privilege account management across multiple ecosystems, from your mobile device to your network and your next gen firewall management to your endpoint devices and so on and so forth. What we are seeing, and Jaymin will talk about, for example, we had a client that was struggling with a SOX 404 audit, and things like IT general controls, focused on IAM in one instance. We were able to use our platform tied in with big ML power to ease their audit, to provide greater insights, to remove the level of effort. We saw probably a 60, 70, 90% in some instances reduction in effort and improvement in functionality and analysis from a risk perspective. We were able to look at the environment and provide guidance where we could improve scalability so that the client was able to manage access needs across multiple access points globally. And, with all of this, we were able to leverage these systems from an insight perspective. So now with this insight perspective, we were able to then look at what was the regulation, the regulatory requirements, the R and GRC, and put insights so that cybersecurity in turn was able to tie in and improve that first line of defense. So with that, I wanted to talk a little bit more on the link to identity here, and we're coming up on time, so I will bring Jaymin into this part to talk a little bit about the link to identity as we see it here. And as we set this up, we're looking at, when we think about cybersecurity, we think about what is the attack surface that someone wants to target. And in our opinion, when we think about business transactions and we think about attack surface, what we think about is what's the cost, what's the financial implication of an attack surface going down, or a target, going down based on an exposed attack surface, and what credentials could be leveraged by an attacker in a cybersecurity attack to take advantage of that attack surface and impact the business transaction. And what we have seen over the last couple of years, especially with the rise in ransomware, every single target has involved a credential and looks at a particular service and looks again after that particular service to extract data. We know this, right? We have seen it in the news and so on. So typically, these are the four things that we have honed in, and we are using our platform. We are using aspects of Big ML's machine learning in this platform to drive our customized engine, which is called Radiate, as we pull data from individuals, from shared accounts, from service accounts, and machine identities. And when we say identity from a MyVayda perspective, we don't mean identities of individuals alone. Just to be clear, everything has a persona, be it a thing, a machine, a service, or a shared account, and a person. So in the context of identity, we're thinking about personas and these various aspects. Now, one of the key things I wanted to highlight on this here, and then again, this is the GRC aspect, is in audit and from running some of the deep analysis, we have seen 20% of folks don't change default password. We have over a 70% failure rate when it comes to audit, to remove or modify default accounts in production. And when we think about, standard transactions and so on, we're seeing an average of, 50% of those default accounts allowing standard transactions within your service account, segment. This alone would lead to a failure from an audit perspective, or if not a failure, basically a deficiency that can impact, if you're a publicly traded company in the US, that can impact your SOX 404 audit, something that will flag an auditor from that, GRC, aspect itself. And that's, of course, not good. So back to the cybersecurity perspective, when we think about attack surfaces, we know we are changing. We know it's dynamic, which is why we have advanced persistent threats. The unfortunate thing is, enterprises are still continuing to act like we're in an environment from 10 years ago. And that needs to change. Threat vectors are also changing. And if we look at it, especially with the rise in ransomware, we're seeing people being the large target of those breaches. And I mentioned earlier that remediation and analysis are being done in silos. We need to unify that. So we have to move from that checklist, identify system and personas that will be used for attack, and then have that single source, unified agnostic system that can interact and provide real insights, leveraging machine learning, leveraging, automation, and basically classifying risk across cyber and GRC that's tied to business operations. So Jaymin, over to you, please. And while Jaymin is setting this up, we're going to share a use case, as I mentioned a little bit before.
In the context of what we just heard from Atikin and what John shared with us, cybersecurity and governance risk compliance. We will focus on in the next 10 to 12 minutes, the focus is going to be on that risk aspect. Essentially, the technology of the platform that John highlighted, John shared with us, MyVayda in particular. The key focus behind this technology, or the construct of this technology, was the problems that we have seen in our lifetime over the past 2 decades. And they have been centered around the typical challenges, the constraints that a lot of these business, including some of the functions that Atikin highlighted, the others that John mentioned about, was how do we, or is there a way to identify and monitor the factors, and by the factors I'm referring to the risk factors, that have an impact on an identity. And this identity, again, a little primer that we got a while ago from John was, this identity does not necessarily, in the context of the ecosystem, have to be a persona-related object. It's both persona and non-persona, that is human and non-human. So to understand the risks that are associated with these types of elements and being able to measure the exposure that these risks are bringing because by virtue of their actions, is something that has always been an open challenge. It is still rather a challenge or a constraint, at least in the industry. MyVayda in particular has been designed to address that aspect where the risk that we are seeing due to the accesses of the identity and the actions that are performed via that access, they can be is there a way that MyVayda can surface that quantitatively? Because think of risk, right? We would have seen this risk. A typical matrix that gets published with on a scale, a calibrated scale of high to medium is what has been the typical approach. But MyVayda, what we have done is we have taken a different, we have taken this construct and flipped it on its head. So we take the risk and surface those risks in a manner where there can be a quantitative attribution to all the risks that are prevalent due to accesses and authorization. And needless to mention, if you notice on the slide again, the audience that MyVayda is catering to is twofold. It is by and large the business, but besides the business, what it also enables the businesses to take these reports, the output that MyVayda is generating, and these are reports that are risk ranked, and bring it to board's attention where they can talk in a language which is common, which the board understands. And what is that language? That language is nothing but it is in dollars and cents. So this is the key construct where MyVayda has been pivoted. All of this, as we said the stage earlier, is rolling up to identity. Now, how is it that MyVayda is doing it? And we'll see, again, a demo too, in terms of what are the various interfaces. There are key modules. The first module is the user access module, which we call it as the identity trust module. The function, the objective of this module is it dynamically evaluates and analyzes users' access authorization. And access is across platform systems, applications, and what have we, hybrid on-prem, take the entire ecosystem. And it discovers relationship between the user's access and their usage within high-dimensional data set. Now, if you see on the left side, there is a heavy role that BigML is playing here because we are using a couple of the models unsupervised, as Atikin highlighted in the opening pitch, that a lot of things that we are seeing in the GRC space is again being powered by the unsupervised algorithms. The second module, which is another key module again from MyVayda, is the user actions or the security analytics. Now, what this does is it processes the various aspects of user actions, the user actions across the enterprise. It builds a baseline. It establishes a baseline, and using that baseline, which is nothing but the user behavior, and using that baseline, it then starts identifying and prioritizing deviations in what could be a potential signal of threat or indicator of compromise. From this, that is the first two modules, what MyVayda is doing, the third module is the risk meter module. It takes these inputs from the user accesses, which are the outliers. It takes the input from the user actions, which again are the ones which are indicators of signals of threat, and then it compounds those risks. But while it is doing that, it is generating an estimate, a simulated estimate of how does that risk translate into dollars and cents. Now, this is something which is a key differentiator when we talk about risk, because there has been constraint in terms of the typical communication that happens between, take the technology function, which typically rolls up to the CISO or the CIO, and for the CISO and CIO to take it back, take it up to the board to establish that common framework, that language is what is where the key output is being generated by MyVayda. And the cost I just mentioned, it gives an estimate of the business value of all the risks that are being identified. What we'll do quickly now is we'll go through the demo. I'll switch back. Yeah, so we are logging in with a particular user. We are letting the system build the context. And in the interest of time, what I've done is I've already made this as a user login, and this is where we land up. Now, if you notice again, the modules that I just highlighted, the modules of after a successful login for that persona, it has built. We are navigating. It took us to the landing page, and this is the gateway for MyVayda's functional modules. Each of these modules are providing distinctive insights. We'll take the first one, which is the identity trust first, and see what is the role that BigML is bringing to the table. Now, this is the identity trust module. So if you notice, what this module is surfacing is, it is bringing out all users. And what are these users? These are users that have a risk associated with them. And if you notice in the cards again, these are the key trending users, the users who have a risk associated with them. But for those users, what are those factors of risk? Either due to applications, and when we say applications, it is the access associated with the applications, or whether the assets or the geographies. It has pulled up these cards, and one of the users is what we are going to navigate. Here is where we will get the details for that user. And again, if you notice here, we will see a breakup of what the various risk factors are. But what is it that is something that will be of interest to all of us is this particular segment. Now, powered by BigML's anomaly detection module, what we are seeing here is for Chris Charan, all the accesses that Chris has and the actions that Chris is performing via her access, it has profiled all those access. So there are a lot of data sources, a rich connected fabric, which MyVayda has. MyVayda has built that aggregation layer. It has normalized the data, contextualized the data, and then it has used BigML's anomaly detection models, the unsupervised ones, to find outliers within that usage that we are seeing via the access for Chris Charan here. And the output that we are getting back from the anomaly detection module MyVayda's Radiate engine is then dynamically generating a risk score for the outliers. So here we'll see that these are the risk scores. While it is generating that, it is also presenting a flattened view. And this is something which is very, very tedious, very, very cumbersome when we look at all the enterprises. But it builds up a flattened view of the access authorizations within the system. And this risk that we are seeing becomes an input to the risk meter module, which is one of the critical, significant factors that is required to see, to monitor, to detect in terms of what are the prevalent indicators of compromise that could potentially be a point of inflict or a point of damage. Along with that, what it is also doing is, if you notice, it is also bringing in everything that is related to assets. So all the assets that Chris is using, and if there are, again, anomalies or outliers via the actions of the transactions that Chris is performing on these assets, it brings that up also, and then it rolls it up on a scale of 1 to 10. Again, here, heavy usage of BigML's anomaly detection. And similarly, geography, this is the third attribution where the continuous monitoring is performed by MyVayda for all the authentication events. It takes those authentication events, and the moment there is a deviation where a typical case, a point in time instances, if there are instances where authentication are being performed from multiple locations, not a standard scenario at all. It immediately will be able to flag, but at the same time, it will also be able to bubble it up into the overall identity risk score. And once it has this, the other module that we would like to go into is the security analytics. Now, within security analytics, the key function here, as I mentioned earlier, it has built a baseline of user actions by learning from the data ingested from applications, business systems, mainframe systems. So here we'll see that we have AS402, and so it has taken the data from these systems or applications, and the actual number of events that it has processed, even for this demo environment purposes, it has taken events from scaling from 10K all the way up to little over 100K. And out of that, notice this, it has just identified in terms of what are the anomalous events within that. So in this case, the user can go and start reviewing or acknowledging that these are events or actions that definitely need to be acted upon. And so essentially what it does is, again, powered by BigML, the anomaly detection is what is being used here to highlight the risk scores that we are seeing tagged to each of these events. And because there is a review, so there is a feedback loop also, which is enabled here. And this feedback loop is then given to BigML's anomaly detection model, where if there are false positives that are emerging out, they can at least be contained and suppressed. And quickly, we just, I'll go to the third module, which is a risk meter module. Now, all that we saw from the identity trust, the security analytics, what is essential? One thing that we have seen in the industry that has been missing is establishing a traceability between the business applications and the underlying IT infrastructure by factoring in parameters of the existing controls. So what are the controls? What is the maturity of the controls? That is taken as an input within this module. What are the assets which are critical assets? That's the other thing that is also taken as an input. But the significant part, along with the controls and the assets, the last part is the threats. So these are the threats that we saw in the identity trust, the risk indicators for the access. Again, the risk indicators or the indicators of compromise, which are signals of threat from the security analytics module, both powered by BigML's anomaly detection. And what it has done is it has taken all that risk score, it has rolled it up into impact vectors, and it has applied simulation to generate what is called as annualized loss expectancy. So the risk that was there, besides it being graded on a scale of 1 to 10, now we know what is the impact, what is the value that is at loss due to the events that are happening, due to the access that is there right now within the ecosystem. This information is something that then can be taken up by the business and the board, and they can then translate it into what will happen with this risk and where is it that we need to do strategic prioritization.
For instance, as Jaymin's bringing that up, from an executive perspective, if I have to present to a board of directors, one of the things that the board would ask is, why are you asking for X amount of dollars? You want $10 million to run security. What are we getting for that? What is the return on investment? And with MyVayda, now we can look at the aggregate loss exposure. We can look at the costs, the fees, legal fees, business interruption in the event of an outage, an attack, ransomware, or otherwise. And then we look at the GRC aspect, the regulatory. How much are we, paying for if there's a fine, or audit or external consultants and so on. And we have that cost breakup where now we can approach the board of directors from a financial perspective and say, okay, we need $15 million for security. We need $10 million for security. And here is why. We're going to break this down in financial terms, line items. When an attack occurs, it costs this amount of dollars. When that attack occurs, it comes with other fees now because we have to bring in consultants, remediation, testing, response, maybe rebuilding systems, as in the case of a ransomware attack. And, that arms our leadership team with the right tools to speak from a financial perspective. Jaymin?
Oh yeah, thanks, John. That's where we wanted to summarize. So thank you.